A man often returns to the energy he once took for granted because human nature has a strange way of revealing value only after distance has magnified it. When he was present in your life, he may have mistaken your kindness for routine, your support for something automatic, your patience for something he deserved without effort. People rarely appreciate what consistently holds them until that stability disappears. The energy you carry, your softness, your warmth, your capacity to understand without judgment becomes a background melody he stopped listening to. But when that melody goes silent, suddenly the absence becomes louder than the presence ever was. He begins to feel the void where your reassurance once lived. He starts to sense the difference in his emotional atmosphere. That difference, that shift triggers a realization that he had access to something powerful, something rare, something nourishing that he never fully valued when it was available in abundance. Your energy is not just emotional, it is spiritual. It is the way you walk into a room and shift the environment without speaking. It is the way your presence calms chaos and offers clarity without demanding anything in return. A man may not consciously recognize the depth of that influence while he is wrapped in his own distractions or ego-driven impulses. But life has a way of removing illusions. And once he steps away, either by choice or immaturity, he encounters a colder world, a world where the emotional care you provided does not exist in the same form. Suddenly, the comfort he dismissed becomes the comfort he craves. The emotional nourishment he overlooked becomes the emotional hunger he cannot satisfy anywhere else. He starts remembering the peace he felt around you and comparing it to the noise he feels everywhere else. This is where the shift begins, the moment he realizes that your energy was not ordinary. It was a sanctuary, and he walked away from it. When your energy changes, it alters his perception of himself. A woman doesn't truly realize her power until she withdraws it. When you stop pouring, he starts noticing the emptiness. When you stop overgiving, he starts feeling the imbalance. When you stop trying to fix, heal, or understand him, he is forced to face the truth that he was drawing strength from you without ever acknowledging it. He comes face to face with his own emotional dependence, and it frightens him. Most men do not return for love. They return for the emotional regulation they lost. They come back because you made their world easier to manage, their thoughts calmer, their fears smaller. Your presence, your empathy, became a psychological cushion that protected him from his own chaos. Once that cushion is gone, life suddenly feels harder, colder, more overwhelming. That discomfort pulls him back toward the energy he once dismissed. He also returns because a shift in your energy sends a signal he cannot ignore. When you heal, he feels it. When you emotionally detach, he senses it. When you start to value yourself again, when you stop chasing validation, when you stop pleading to be understood, something inside him wakes up. He begins to realize that the access he once enjoyed is no longer guaranteed. Your strength unsettles him. Your peace exposes his instability. Your growth highlights his stagnation. The more you rise, the more he feels the distance between who he is and who he pretended to be. That distance awakens a longing not for commitment or change, but for the emotional comfort he once received from you effortlessly. Men are naturally drawn to the source of their emotional fulfillment. They gravitate back to what made them feel significant, valued, supported, even if they never openly admitted their dependence. When you were accessible, your energy was a constant stream flowing toward him. But when that stream dries up, he feels the drought. He feels the scarcity. And scarcity creates desire. He begins to crave the emotional ecosystem you once provided, the way you understood him when he made no sense, the way you believed in him when he doubted himself, the way you stayed patient even when he was inconsistent. Those memories start replaying in his mind, not because he has transformed, but because your energy was a shelter from the emotional storm he carries within himself. A man returns because your absence reveals the truth he avoided in your presence. It reveals how much of his emotional stability came from you. It exposes how deeply your energy influenced his mood, his decisions, his self-belief. It reminds him that not everyone will tolerate his flaws, not everyone will interpret his silence correctly, not everyone will offer understanding without being asked. He starts to realize he had something exceptional, but only after he's already mishandled it. And this realization does not appear in a single moment. It builds slowly, subtly, until it becomes an undeniable internal pull that draws him back toward the energy that once made him feel safe, even when he didn't deserve that safety. Distance creates the kind of silence that reveals truths people avoid when they are standing too close. When a woman steps back emotionally, mentally, spiritually or physically, the entire dynamic of the relationship shifts. The noise of arguments, confusion, expectations, and emotional chaos begins to fade, leaving behind a clarity that neither person could fully recognize when they were entangled. For a man, this distance becomes a mirror. It reflects things he didn't want to see, didn't pay attention to, or didn't value when you were present. He begins to feel the impact of the space you created, not because he suddenly became wiser, but because absence forces him to confront the reality he ignored when comfort was readily available to him. A man often does not understand what he had until your energy no longer cushions his world. The space you create begins to echo the value he once dismissed. When there is distance, something powerful happens. Your silence starts speaking louder than your words ever could. Every message you stop sending, every call you don't make, every moment you choose yourself instead of chasing closure becomes a statement of self-worth that reaches him in ways your explanations never did. Men often tune out words, but they pay attention to behavior. And nothing speaks louder than a woman who stops trying to prove her value. The moment you pull back, he feels the vacuum. He notices the shift in energy. He realizes the emotional certainty he once depended on is no longer there. And in that realization, he begins to question his decisions, his actions, and his assumptions. Distance forces him to see the contrast between how stable life felt with you and how unstable it feels without you. Distance also dismantles the illusions he created in his mind to justify his actions. When he hurt you, walked away, or stopped valuing you, he may have convinced himself that you would always be there, always waiting, always available, always forgiving. But when you step back, that illusion collapses. He begins to recognize that you are not as dependent on him as he believed. This shift threatens his ego. It disrupts the narrative he created about you, about himself, and about the control he thought he had. The silence forces him to sit with his own choices without the comfort of your reassurance or the distraction of your presence. This is often the moment he starts feeling regret, confusion, or an unexpected pull toward you. Not because he suddenly matured, but because the distance stripped away the emotional security he took for granted. In the space you create, he begins to remember things he overlooked, the way you cared without being asked, the way you understood what he didn't say, the way your presence made life feel lighter, even on his darkest days. These memories surface not out of romance, but out of comparison. Life without your emotional support feels heavier. Conversations feel emptier. Connections feel shallow. The void becomes more noticeable with time, especially when he interacts with others and realizes not everyone possesses your patience, your grace, your emotional intelligence. He begins to understand piece by piece that what he walked away from was not ordinary. Distance makes this truth impossible to deny. Your distance also changes his internal rhythm. When you were involved, you adjusted your emotional pace to match his inconsistency. You accommodated his moods, his silence, his confusion, his unpredictability. But when you pull away, he is forced to regulate himself. He must deal with his own emotional weight. He must face the patterns he once projected onto you. This self-confrontation is uncomfortable, and discomfort is often the catalyst that pulls a man back. Not because he is ready to change, but because he wants relief from the emotional discomfort your absence triggered. He comes back seeking comfort, familiarity, validation, or a sense of power he feels slipping away. Distance also reveals your growth. When you focus on yourself, your energy evolves. You become calmer, stronger, more grounded. You begin to see your own worth in ways you couldn't when you were emotionally entangled with him. This transformation radiates, and he feels it even from afar. A woman who reclaims her power becomes magnetic. Her detachment becomes a signal that she has stepped into a new version of herself. This unsettles him because it means he no longer has access to the version of you he controlled. Your emotional evolution exposes how stagnant he is. It confronts him with the truth that you are rising while he is still repeating the same patterns. This contrast becomes a pull that brings him back toward you, not always with clarity, but often with confusion masked as desire. In the distance, he begins to sense what he didn't sense before: the strength of your absence. Absence is felt in moments of weakness, in late-night thoughts, in unresolved guilt, in emotional emptiness, in comparisons he did not expect to make. The silence becomes a reminder of everything he mishandled. The space becomes a teacher that you could never become while you were trying to be understood. Through distance, he sees what presence never revealed. Through silence, he hears truths he never listened to. Through space, he realizes that what he lost was not just a person, but a source of emotional depth he cannot easily replace. A man often returns when he feels the loss of his personal power, because hurting you may have given him a temporary sense of control, but your withdrawal exposes how fragile that control actually was. When he walked away, dismissed your feelings, or acted like your emotions didn't matter, he was operating from a place where he believed he was in charge of the dynamic. He assumed you would continue giving, continue waiting, continue understanding, continue forgiving because that pattern benefited him. He felt powerful when you were the one trying to hold the connection together. But when you finally step back, when you stop chasing, stop explaining yourself, stop seeking validation, stop making excuses for him, that shift hits him harder than he expects. Suddenly, the emotional power he believed he possessed begins to slip out of his hands. This loss of perceived control shakes him in ways he doesn't openly admit. The truth is that many men equate emotional influence with emotional security. As long as they feel they have access to you, they feel safe, not because they truly appreciate your presence, but because it reassures them that they are still significant in your world. When you detach, that reassurance disappears. He begins to sense the reality that he is no longer at the center of your emotional universe. This realization unsettles him. It forces him to confront the fact that the dynamic he relied on is no longer predictable. And when a man loses predictability, he feels powerless. The ego reacts strongly to the idea of losing something it once controlled, even if he did not value it properly when he had it. When you pull your energy back, he feels the imbalance immediately. He notices the absence of your effort, the absence of your emotional availability, the absence of your softness toward him. At first, he may pretend he doesn't care. He may act unaffected. He may distract himself. But underneath the surface, something begins to shift. He starts feeling a subtle anxiety, a sense that something he depended on emotionally is slipping away. This discomfort is not always recognized as regret or love. Sometimes it is simply the fear of losing influence. And that fear is powerful enough to pull him back toward you. The ego hates losing its source of validation, its source of comfort, its source of emotional safety. A man might come back because your detachment forces him to feel his own emotional insufficiency. When you were giving, he didn't have to look closely at himself. He didn't have to examine his flaws, insecurities, or patterns. You were the emotional cushion that softened the edges of his own issues. But once you step away, he is left alone with the parts of himself he tried to silence through your presence. The silence becomes a confrontation. The empty space where your support once existed becomes a spotlight on everything he avoided facing. That emotional exposure creates a sense of vulnerability he is not prepared for. To soothe that vulnerability, he gravitates back to you, not because he has resolved anything within himself, but because you made his emotional world feel easier to manage. Your withdrawal marks the moment the emotional dynamic shifts. When you stop giving, he is forced to start noticing. When you stop trying to fix things, he is forced to feel the consequences of his decisions. When you stop being accessible, he is forced to acknowledge how much he depended on your availability. This shift in power threatens him because it dismantles the narrative he built about his role in your life. He may have believed he could walk in and out whenever he pleased. He may have assumed you would always be there waiting, but your silence challenges that belief. Your distance redefines the dynamic. It sends a message that you are no longer under emotional control. This loss of power stirs something in him, a mix of confusion, longing, and fear that drives him back toward you. The need to reclaim a sense of power also shows up as a sudden desire to reconnect. He might check in unexpectedly, send messages out of nowhere, or show up with concern he never expressed before. These actions are often driven by the fear of losing emotional access. He wants to ensure that he still matters. He wants to verify that you haven't completely detached. He wants to feel in control again, even if he doesn't consciously realize this. Men often misinterpret this feeling as missing you, but beneath that longing is a deeper discomfort, the discomfort of sensing that you are no longer emotionally available to him the way you once were. A man returns because your growth highlights his stagnation. When you step into your power, when you begin healing, when you start valuing yourself, he notices the shift even from a distance. Your elevation makes him feel smaller, not because he truly wants you back, but because he feels the gap widening between who he is and the version of you he can no longer influence. This realization threatens his sense of identity. He cannot stand the thought of becoming irrelevant in a life where he once felt significant. So he comes back not out of transformation, but out of a desire to reclaim a position he feels slipping away. The loss of personal power is a blow to any ego. And when a man senses that your heart is no longer a place he can enter freely, he returns to test whether the door still opens. He comes back to see if he still has emotional access. He comes back to evaluate whether he still matters. He comes back to reclaim a sense of significance he feels leaking away. And often, this return has less to do with love and more to do with the psychological discomfort of losing control over a connection he assumed would always revolve around him. When you begin to grow, evolve, and elevate yourself, something powerful happens that a man does not expect. Your growth becomes a mirror that reflects back to him everything he has avoided seeing within himself. When he hurt you, dismissed you, or treated your emotional presence as something guaranteed, he was operating from a space where he assumed you would remain the same. He expected you to stay in the emotional version of yourself that tolerated his inconsistencies, accepted his excuses, and prioritized his needs over your own. But when you shift, when you begin to heal, when you start investing in yourself, when you stop living from a place of emotional dependency, your transformation becomes a silent confrontation for him. Your growth exposes what he has not grown through. Your strength highlights his weaknesses. Your clarity exposes his confusion. Your evolution makes him realize he is standing still. A man often comes back not because he has changed, but because your growth forces him to confront the truth that he has not. He sees you becoming more grounded, more confident, more self-assured, more emotionally balanced. He notices that you are not reacting the way you used to. You no longer chase the conversations he avoids. You no longer plead for the validation he withheld. You no longer bend yourself to fit the emotional spaces he refused to meet you in. Your silence becomes intentional. Your peace becomes noticeable. Your glow becomes undeniable. This shift disturbs him because it signals that you are outgrowing the version of yourself he could control, predict, or emotionally influence. And when a woman outgrows the version of herself that tolerated mistreatment, she becomes a mirror that reflects a man's lack of growth with uncomfortable clarity. When he looks at you now, he sees a woman who is no longer emotionally dependent on his attention. He sees someone who has stepped into a fuller, stronger, wiser version of herself. This destabilizes him because your evolution disrupts the dynamic he once relied on. When you were insecure, he felt secure. When you doubted yourself, he felt in control. When you overgave, he underdelivered without guilt. But now the roles have shifted. Now you are the one with emotional strength. Now you are the one who chooses, not waits to be chosen. Now you are the one who walks away from what doesn't align with your growth. This reversal confronts him with the parts of himself he never wanted to examine: the immaturity, the emotional avoidance, the lack of self-awareness. Your growth also activates something he cannot escape: comparison. He compares who you were with, who you are becoming, and realizes how much he took for granted. He compares what he had with what he replaced you with, and the difference becomes obvious. He compares the peace you gave him to the emotional instability he experiences without you. He compares the way you loved him to the emptiness he feels now that he is surrounded by people who cannot love with the depth, consistency, and sincerity you carried. These comparisons create discomfort, and discomfort often pulls a man back, not because he is ready to rise to your level, but because he wants to feel the warmth of the version of you he lost. When you grow, you also set boundaries, whether spoken or silent. He feels those boundaries like a wall he never expected to encounter. The access he once enjoyed is no longer open. The emotional generosity he once exploited is no longer available without effort, and boundaries require him to rise, reflect, or retreat. Most men choose to return first, not out of transformation, but out of curiosity. Curiosity about whether your growth is real or temporary. Curiosity about whether the access he once had can be regained. Curiosity about whether he still holds a place in your emotional world. He comes back not because you are the same, but because you are different, and that difference pulls him toward you. Your growth also impacts your vibration. Your energy becomes stronger, clearer, more self-respecting. You start to attract better experiences, healthier thoughts, deeper self-love. This energetic elevation becomes magnetic. Men feel it even when they cannot explain it. They sense when a woman has healed. They sense when she has reclaimed her power. They sense when she no longer needs them. And that feeling is both threatening and attractive. Threatening because it reminds them they no longer hold the same importance. Attractive because strength and self-respect are compelling qualities that draw people in without effort. When a woman grows, she becomes a different emotional environment. A man feels that environment shift. He feels the loss of the version of you that made him comfortable. He feels the presence of the new version of you that demands respect without saying a word. Your transformation highlights the gap between who he is and who he would need to become in order to deserve access to you again. That gap confronts him, it wakes him up, it pulls him back into your orbit, even if he is not ready to rise to the level your growth now requires. Sometimes he returns to try to step back into your life, sometimes to test his relevance, sometimes to see if he can still influence your emotions. But the root of his return often lies in the way your growth exposes the incomplete journey of his own. A man often comes back to test whether access still exists, because for many men, the real question isn't do I love her, but do I still have a place in her heart? When he hurt you or walked away, he may have done so with the belief that you would always remain emotionally available to him. He likely assumed that no matter how far he drifted, he could return and find you standing in the same emotional position, patient, open, forgiving, willing to try again. This assumption is rooted in comfort, not commitment. It is rooted in entitlement, not appreciation. And when he senses, even slightly, that your emotional door may be closing, he is pulled back, not out of love, but out of curiosity, pride, and a desire to confirm that he still holds influence over you. That desire becomes a test, a silent attempt to measure the strength of the emotional bond he once depended on. When a man has hurt you, he often returns because your silence or distance threatens the emotional certainty he once felt. Even if he wasn't ready to commit, even if he wasn't mature enough to value your presence, he still liked knowing you were attached. Your attachment made him feel wanted, significant, validated, and when you withdraw that emotional investment, he feels the shift in power instantly. It unsettles him. He wonders whether someone else has taken his place, whether your heart has healed enough to detach, or whether your self-worth has risen to a level where his old behavior no longer qualifies for entry. This insecurity drives him to return, not with a transformed heart, but with an unsettled ego, seeking clarity on what he still owns. When he comes back to test access, he usually presents himself in subtle, familiar ways. He might send a casual message, something that seems harmless on the surface, but is deeply intentional beneath it. He might bring up a memory, check your emotional temperature, or offer just enough affection to see if your walls will lower. These gestures are not signs of commitment, they are probes. They are emotional experiments designed to evaluate whether you have moved on, or whether he can still step into your life without earning his place. A man who hurt you may not want the responsibility of loving you well, but he still wants the reassurance that he can reach you whenever he feels lonely, insecure, or bored. This is what makes his return a test, not a transformation. Testing access is also rooted in fear, the fear of losing something he assumed he'd always have. Even if he wasn't ready to build a future with you, the idea that you could heal beyond him challenges the narrative he built in his mind about who you are and what you feel. If you become emotionally independent, if you reclaim your power, if you detach from the story he wrote for you, he senses that shift like a threat. This fear leads him to return, to see whether his place in your life is truly gone or whether the emotional pattern you once shared can still be reactivated. He is not returning to rebuild. He is returning to confirm whether the door is locked or still slightly open. A man also tests access because access equals power. As long as he can come back without effort, he feels he still has influence over your emotions. That influence feeds his ego. It reassures him that leaving you wasn't a mistake because he can always return when he feels ready. But the moment he suspects that he no longer has this emotional privilege, he rushes back to confirm. It becomes less about you and more about maintaining his psychological comfort. He doesn't want to face the reality that he lost someone who genuinely cared. He doesn't want to accept that his absence no longer carries weight. He doesn't want to believe that you can build a life where he is no longer relevant. When you've grown, healed, or detached, your energy shifts from needing him to simply observing him. This shift is what he senses. He feels the difference in your tone, your responses, your silence, your boundaries. He notices that you no longer light up the way you once did when he reappeared. This subtle emotional change challenges his perception of you. You're no longer the emotionally available woman he thought he could return to whenever he pleased. Your new energy is less accessible, more grounded, more selective. This unfamiliar version of you makes him curious. It makes him nervous. It makes him want to test whether he still has emotional access, because your strength reveals the weakness of the hold he once believed he had over you. When he comes back, he isn't just testing your heart, he's testing your standards. He wants to know if the boundary you draw is real or just temporary. He wants to know if your self-worth is consistent or dependent on his presence. He wants to know if you've truly outgrown him or if you simply pulled back waiting for him to return. These questions drive him to reappear, not because he is ready to be the partner you deserve, but because he needs answers that only your reaction can give. He comes back to see if the emotional pattern remains intact, because if it does, he can slip back into your life without ever rising to the level of growth you now require. And sometimes he returns simply to confirm that he still holds emotional priority, even if he has no intention of offering you the commitment you once desired. It is an ego-driven reassurance, a subtle way of proving to himself that he still has value in your world. This is why his return is often inconsistent, vague, shallow, and confusing. It mirrors the internal conflict within him. He wants the emotional benefit without the emotional responsibility. He wants access without effort. He wants reassurance without reciprocity. And the moment he senses that this access might be denied, he appears again, not out of genuine transformation, but out of a need to confirm whether the emotional door he once walked through still opens for him in the same way it used to. A man often returns when he realizes you've broken the emotional pattern, because patterns are powerful. They shape familiarity, comfort, and expectation. When he hurt you and you kept trying, when he pulled away and you chased, when he grew silent and you filled the silence, he learned a pattern. No matter what he did, you would still be there. This pattern gave him emotional certainty. It allowed him to behave carelessly without fearing consequences. It gave him the illusion that he could drift in and out of your life and still be welcomed with warmth, softness, and understanding. But the moment you break this cycle, the moment you stop responding, stop explaining, stop proving yourself, stop accepting his inconsistency, something shifts inside him. The predictable emotional rhythm he relied on disappears, and that loss of predictability becomes a shock to his system that draws him back toward you. People don't miss you when you leave, they miss you when you change. When he notices that your reactions are no longer driven by emotional attachment but by self-respect, he feels the shift in ways he didn't anticipate. The dynamic where he had emotional leverage dissolves, and he senses that the power he once held has quietly returned to you. When you break the pattern, you teach him a new truth. He no longer has the influence he once enjoyed. That realization unsettles him because it contradicts everything he believed about your attachment. It forces him to question his assumptions. It forces him to confront the idea that he may have pushed too far. And this internal discomfort, this fear of losing access to the emotional comfort you once provided, creates the pull that makes him come back. When the pattern breaks, he begins to remember the version of you he once knew. The one who cared deeply, the one who listened, the one who showed up for him even when he didn't show up for himself. But now that version of you is inaccessible, distant, evolved. Your silence makes him curious. Your indifference makes him uneasy. Your emotional strength makes him question whether he ever truly understood your value. This new version of you confronts him with a truth he didn't want to see. You were not dependent on him, you were simply committed. And now that commitment has shifted inward toward your own healing, your peace, your growth. This shift destabilizes him because it dismantles the emotional pattern that once protected his ego. Breaking the pattern also reveals how much effort he never had to make. When you stop giving, he realizes how much you gave. When you stop trying to fix things, he realizes how many problems you carried on your back. When you stop explaining your feelings, he realizes how much emotional labor you did for the relationship. And when you stop chasing, he realizes that he was never being pursued by entitlement, but by love. These realizations come slowly, sometimes subconsciously, but they come nonetheless. And each realization acts like a tug, a pull, a reminder that what he walked away from wasn't just a woman, it was an entire emotional ecosystem built around care, understanding, and support. A man may return not because he has grown, but because the dynamic that once fed his ego has collapsed. He can no longer rely on your predictable reactions. He can no longer assume your forgiveness. He can no longer count on your availability. The safety net he once took for granted is no longer beneath him. And this loss of emotional certainty triggers internal panic. He begins to wonder if someone else has replaced the space he once occupied. He begins to question whether your heart has started healing in ways that make him irrelevant. These questions fuel his return because he wants to confirm whether he truly lost the emotional access he never thought he would lose. When you break the emotional pattern, something spiritual happens. You reclaim parts of yourself you had been giving away. You become more grounded. You become more centered. Your energy stops leaking towards someone who mishandled it and instead flows back into your own growth. This energetic shift is powerful, and he feels it even if he can't articulate it. Men can sense when they no longer have emotional sway over a woman. They can feel when her heart detaches. They can feel when her presence is no longer fueled by seeking approval, but by self-worth. This change in energy is often stronger than anything you could say with words. It disrupts the internal rhythm he once depended on. It interrupts the emotional familiarity that made him feel comfortable walking away and coming back at will. Breaking the pattern also challenges the identity he built within the relationship. When you were consistent and he was inconsistent, he felt in control. But when your consistency turns inward and your emotional investment shifts toward yourself, he is forced to confront the imbalance he created. He sees that you are no longer the woman waiting for him to choose you. You are the woman who chooses herself. This revelation stings because it highlights his lack of effort, his immaturity, his emotional avoidance. It reveals that he wasn't the one who held the relationship together, you were. And now that you have stopped, the entire structure begins to crumble. His return is often an attempt to restore the pattern, not the relationship. He comes back to see if he can slip into the old dynamic, if he can trigger the old version of you, if he can reignite the familiar emotional loop that kept you connected to him. He wants to know whether you truly changed or whether your silence is just a temporary reaction. He wants to test the strength of your new boundaries. He wants to verify whether he still has emotional power. The test is not about love. It's about seeing whether the cycle can continue. Because deep down, he knows that if the pattern is truly broken, then the version of you he once had access to is gone. And losing that version of you means losing the emotional advantage he never realized he depended on so heavily.